She stood near the entrance for a long moment, unsure if she should step inside or turn back. The hall was larger than she expected. Soft lights hung from the ceiling, and the sound of quiet talking filled the space. People were dressed well, laughing, confident, like they belonged there. She did not feel the same. Her clothes were clean but simple. Her shoes showed signs of long use. She kept her hands close to her body, as if trying to take up less space. In the center of the hall stood a piano. It was polished, black, and beautiful. The lid was open, and the keys shone under the lights. It looked untouched, almost waiting. For her, the piano felt familiar, like an old friend she had not seen in a long time. Her eyes stayed on it, even as people walked past her without noticing. She had not planned to play. At least, not fully. She had only come to see it, to be close to it. Music had always pulled her in like this. No matter how tired she was, no matter how heavy life felt, music always made her feel lighter, even if only for a moment. She took a small step forward. No one stopped her. Another step. Her heart started beating faster. With every step, doubts filled her mind. What if they laugh? What if her hands shake? What if she forgets everything the moment she touches the keys? She reached the piano and stood beside it. From here, she could hear people more clearly. A few noticed her now. Their eyes moved from her face to her clothes and back again. Some whispered to each other. She could feel it, even without hearing the words. She slowly sat down on the bench. The sound of the bench moving was louder than she expected. A few heads turned. Someone near the back laughed softly. Another voice said something she couldn't fully hear, but the tone was enough. It was not kind. Her fingers hovered over the keys. They were still, but inside she was shaking. The piano felt different from the ones she was used to. At home, the keys were chipped, some heavier than others. A few notes didn't work at all. This piano was smooth and perfect. It scared her. She pressed one key lightly just to feel it. The sound echoed gently through the hall. That single note was enough to draw more attention. A few people laughed openly now. Does she even know how to play? Someone said, not caring if she heard. Another voice followed, louder. This isn't a practice room. Her face grew warm. She felt her throat tighten. For a moment she thought about standing up and walking away. No one would stop her. No one would remember her after a few minutes. That would be easier, but her hands did not move away from the keys. She remembered the first time she ever touched a piano. It was years ago, in a place much smaller than this hall. The piano was old and out of tune. She had been told not to touch it. She touched it anyway. That first sound had stayed with her ever since. Music had never been a hobby for her. It was a hiding place. When things got loud at home, when words hurt more than silence, she played. When she felt invisible, she played. No one had clapped for her back then. No one had told her she was good. But the piano never judged her. It only responded. Another laugh pulled her back to the present. Someone stop her before she embarrasses herself. A man said, smiling like it was a joke. She lowered her head slightly. Her eyes fixed on the keys. She took a slow breath. Then another. Her fingers trembled, but they were warming up, remembering movements they had practiced thousands of times in secret. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just wanted to play. Just once on a real piano, without broken keys, without rushing, without fear of being told to stop. The noise around her continued. People talked over her, assuming she would give up. Someone walked past and shook their head. Another person raised a phone, not to record her talent, but to capture a moment they thought would be funny. She closed her eyes for a second. In that second, the hall disappeared. The people disappeared. The laughter faded. There was only her and the piano, just like before. Just like always, her fingers finally pressed down on the keys again, this time with purpose. Not loud, not dramatic. Just steady. A few people noticed the change. The sound was not random. It wasn't careless. It was controlled, gentle, and clear. Still, most did not pay attention yet. They had already decided who she was. She felt her shoulders relax slightly. The tension in her chest loosened. Her hands began to move more freely. Each note gave her a little more courage. Each sound reminded her why she was there. She did not look up. She did not look at the crowd. She stayed with the piano, letting it guide her. The music was simple at first, almost shy, but it was honest. It came from a place deeper than fear. Somewhere in the hall, a conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone frowned, confused, as if trying to understand what they were hearing. Another person leaned closer, their laughter fading into silence. She did not notice any of that yet. She was still fighting her own doubts, still pushing past the voice in her head that told her she did not belong. Her foot found the pedal. Her hands moved with more confidence now. The music slowly grew like a story unfolding. It carried pieces of her life, though no one there knew it yet. This was the moment that decided everything. Whether she would run away again or stay. Whether she would keep hiding or finally allow herself to be seen. The girl who had been laughed at was still sitting there, still surrounded by judgment. But something had already begun to change. Not in the crowd yet, but inside her, and once that change started, it could not be stopped. She continued to play, and as her fingers moved over the keys, her mind wandered to memories she had long kept to herself. Music had always been her secret world. At home, there had been noise and arguments, moments when she felt small and unseen. The piano had been her escape. Even when life felt impossible, when the weight of disappointment pressed down on her shoulders, she could sit at the piano and feel a sense of freedom she could find nowhere else. Each note she struck was a quiet rebellion against the world that had overlooked her so often. She remembered the first time she had truly felt music in her bones. It was in a small, dimly lit room where the piano had seen better days. Some of the keys were broken. Others refused to make a sound when pressed. But she had learned to work around it. She had spent hours practicing simple melodies, pressing each key until she could hear a tune in her head come to life. No one had applauded her back then. No one had watched or cared. And yet, she had felt something powerful, the understanding that her hands could create beauty from silence. That realization had stayed with her all these years. Her life had not been easy. There had been days without enough food, days filled with chores that left her exhausted before she could even sit at the piano. People had laughed at her at school, at the market, even at home sometimes. They had told her she was too quiet, too fragile, not special enough to stand out. They had mocked her dreams, saying music was useless, that she should focus on real things. But the piano had always whispered back, "You are capable. You are strong. You belong here." She could feel the years of hidden practice now as her fingers moved almost automatically. The patterns were ingrained in her memory like footprints in sand. Each note carried a piece of her story, the nights she had cried over mistakes. The mornings she had risen early to practice before the world woke up. The afternoons she had stolen to herself when life demanded too much. She had never played for anyone who mattered, never for applause or approval, just for herself. But sitting there in the hall, she realized something new. Maybe, just maybe, she could share that part of herself with the world. As she played, she remembered a particular teacher from her childhood. He had seen her once, very briefly, and had told her she had potential, but he had not understood her struggles. He could not have known how much effort it took for her to simply sit at a piano every day, how many times she had fallen and picked herself back up. That memory brought a small smile to her lips. She had learned long ago not to wait for recognition. She had learned that music was its own reward, that the act of creating beauty, even in silence, mattered more than anyone else's opinion. But today was different. Today she was not alone. The hall was full of people. Some were laughing, some were whispering. A few were even recording her, though she could not tell if it was for mockery or admiration. The presence of others made her nervous, but it also added weight to every note. She realized that music had never been just an escape. It was a language she could use to speak without words. And maybe now she could let that language be heard. Her thoughts drifted to the time she had been ignored. How often had she been laughed at for trying? How many people had said she was wasting her time, that she would never succeed? And yet she was still here, still playing. That thought strengthened her. Each key she pressed was a reminder of how far she had come, how much courage it took to keep believing in herself when no one else did. She realized that the people in the hall were not laughing at her anymore, not truly. Some still chuckled nervously, unsure what to make of the sound coming from her hands. Others were quiet, listening. Her mind also wandered to the simple joys of learning. How wonderful it had felt when she first learned a new scale or mastered a tricky passage. How satisfying it had been to hear the melodies she imagined finally emerge from the piano. Those small victories had been hers alone, and she had cherished each one. She remembered hiding in corners, practicing while no one watched, pretending the world outside did not exist. That secrecy had made the music hers, personal, pure. And now, for the first time, she felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. What if sharing it openly could be as rewarding as the private moments she had known? Her eyes occasionally flicked toward the audience, though she did not let herself focus too long on them. Faces blurred together, some curious, some skeptical. She could feel their judgment like a weight on her shoulders, but she refused to let it stop her. Instead, she let it fuel her, channeling nervous energy into the music. Her hands moved faster now, yet every note was deliberate. She could feel the rhythm in her chest, the pulse of life she had carried with her all these years. It was not just music anymore, it was a declaration. Even as the laughter faded into background noise, she felt her heart racing. This moment, fragile and tense, was unlike anything she had experienced. It was the first time her private world had collided with the public one. And yet, instead of retreating, she played on, trusting her instincts, trusting the years of practice and quiet determination that had brought her here. Each note felt like a bridge, connecting the girl she had been to the person she was becoming. She remembered the nights she had almost given up, when mistakes had seemed too many and practice too hard. She remembered the days she had felt invisible, when nobody saw her efforts or her talent. And she thought about how different it felt now, to have people, strangers, even watching, and how strangely comforting it could be if they listened without judgment. Music had always been a friend. Now it had the chance to become a voice that others could hear, too. Her mind settled into a quiet focus. The piano responded as if it recognized her resolve. The keys sang under her fingers, releasing a melody that was both soft and strong, delicate and determined. The sound filled the hall, wrapping around the audience in a gentle embrace. She could feel her past, her struggles, and her secret triumphs resonating through the notes. Every whisper of pain, every echo of hope, every silent victory found its place in the music, and as she played, she understood something important. Music had always been more than notes and rhythms. It was courage. It was resilience. It was the power to rise above doubt and fear, to express truth even when the world tried to silence her. Sitting there, fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, she felt the invisible chains of judgment start to loosen. She was not just a girl who had been laughed at. She was someone who had survived. Someone who had created beauty in spite of everything. Her melody grew, becoming richer and fuller, carrying with it the weight of years and the light of hope. The audience began to shift subtly. Some leaned forward, curious. Some straightened, attentive. The whispers stopped. The laughter faded completely, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to ask, who was this girl, and where had she been all this time? For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine that this could be the beginning of something new. That the music she had kept hidden could now be shared. That her talent, long overlooked, could finally be seen. And even though doubt still lingered at the edges of her mind, it was no longer powerful enough to stop her. She played on, letting each note tell a story only she knew fully. The music was her past, her present, and perhaps even a glimpse of her future. And in that moment, the hall, the people, and the piano were all part of something larger, a quiet, unfolding miracle that had begun with a single girl daring to touch the keys. Her fingers moved over the keys with more confidence now. The melody she played was no longer hesitant. Each note came with purpose, telling a story that words could never fully express. It was a story of quiet battles, of struggles fought alone, of small victories that had felt enormous at the time. The music was alive, carrying emotions too deep for her to speak aloud. Yet everyone in the hall could feel them in some way. At first, some people barely noticed. They were distracted by their own conversations, their phones, their routines. But slowly, the sound began to cut through the noise. It was different from anything they had expected. The melody was soft, but it had a clarity that demanded attention. It was simple, yet layered, revealing the skill and patience behind every movement of her hands. One by one, people stopped talking. Eyes lifted. Faces turned toward her. The laughter that had once filled the hall was gone. She did not look up. She did not need to. She had learned long ago that the music spoke louder than her presence ever could. She let herself sink into it, letting the piano carry her thoughts and memories. She thought of the nights she had spent practicing in darkness, when the house was silent and the world seemed asleep. She remembered the times she had cried over mistakes, the times her hands had felt clumsy and unworthy. But she also remembered the tiny triumphs, the moment a passage finally sounded right, the feeling of creating something beautiful from nothing. That joy fueled her now, each note infused with all the effort, pain, and hope of the past years. The hall had grown quiet. Even the people who had been laughing before were now listening intently. They did not yet understand the story behind the music, but they could sense its honesty. The notes carried her emotions, raw and unfiltered. Some furrowed their brows, trying to interpret what they were hearing. Others leaned closer, drawn by the purity of the sound. The girl, once dismissed, was now commanding attention without a single word. Her fingers flew across the keys, moving faster now, but still controlled. She did not force the melody. She let it flow naturally, guided by instinct and years of practice. Every chord, every pause, every subtle shift in tempo reflected her inner world. People began to feel it too, the tension, the release, the hope that threaded through the music. It was as if she had opened a door to a part of herself that had been locked away, and, for the first time, strangers were being allowed inside. She remembered the first time she had performed for anyone, even if it had only been a single neighbor or a family member who had stopped to listen. Back then, her hands had shaken and her heart had raced. She had been terrified of making a mistake, of being judged, of being laughed at. But she had learned something important from that fear, that the act of playing itself, the courage to continue despite doubt, was more valuable than perfection. That lesson stayed with her, and it guided her now. As the melody developed, it took on a life of its own. She felt herself becoming part of it, her body and mind completely aligned with the music. The hall seemed to shift around her. The air was charged with a strange energy. People were no longer observers. They were witnesses. They could feel the history, the struggle, and the quiet strength embedded in each note. Some clasped their hands together unconsciously. Others leaned back, eyes closed, absorbing the sound, as if it could touch something deep inside them. She was aware of a few who were recording her on their phones. At first, she felt a flicker of annoyance, thinking they might be mocking her. But as she continued to play, she realized they were capturing something extraordinary. Something they would want to remember. Something they could not have expected from the girl they had laughed at moments before. The music became richer, more complex. She allowed herself to improvise, letting instinct guide her through a series of notes that were entirely her own. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse that mirrored the beating of her heart. Each chord seemed to resonate with the emotions she had carried for so long: loneliness, determination, hope, and the quiet pride of surviving hardships that no one else could see. For the first time, she felt a sense of control over the room. The laughter, the whispers, the judgments, they no longer mattered. They could only watch, listen, and feel what she chose to share. It was a powerful sensation. She realized that all the time she had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated had brought her to this exact moment. Every struggle, every tear, every quiet hour spent practicing in secret had prepared her for this. Her eyes remained on the keys. but she was aware of the subtle shifts in the audience. Heads turned toward her in amazement. People who had scoffed were now leaning forward. Those who had mocked her in whispers were now silent, captivated. The energy in the hall had changed. It was no longer a space where she was being judged. It had become a space where her music ruled, where her voice, though wordless, was being heard loud and clear. She allowed herself a small smile, though no one could see it. She had always known that music could reach people in ways words never could. Now she was seeing it happen before her eyes. The melody carried everything she had been unable to express, the fear, the doubt, the resilience, and the quiet triumphs of years spent learning, failing, and continuing anyway. The hall was no longer just a hall. It was a living, breathing space filled with the echo of her journey. Each note seemed to linger in the air longer than before, wrapping around the listeners, connecting them to her story without a single word. People began to shift in their seats, unconsciously leaning toward her, drawn in by the authenticity of what they were hearing. As she reached a particularly difficult passage, her fingers moved with fluidity, effortlessly transitioning from one chord to the next. The complexity of the music was breathtaking, not because it was showy, but because it carried the depth of her experience. The audience was aware of it, even if they did not fully understand why. Some were holding their breath, captivated. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. For the first time, she felt something she had never felt before, a connection. Not just to the piano or to the music, but to the people listening. Even though they were strangers, they were experiencing something she had carried inside for years. That realization made her heart swell. She had given herself fully to the music, and now it was touching others in a way she had only ever dreamed of. She allowed the melody to slow, to soften, to breathe. Each note was deliberate, carrying the weight of her story, but also a sense of hope. She did not need to rush. She did not need to prove anything. She simply let the music speak for her. And in that silence between notes, she could feel the audience leaning in, waiting, listening, feeling. The final section of the piece approached. She felt a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. Her hands had grown tired, but her spirit was strong. Every note she struck was a testament to her perseverance, a declaration that she had arrived, that she had something to offer the world. The music soared, filling the hall with a richness that left no room for doubt or ridicule. When she finally ended the piece, there was a moment of silence, a pause that seemed to stretch, filled with the echoes of the notes that had just been played. The audience held their breath, unsure how to respond, as if afraid to break the magic of what they had just experienced. Then slowly claps began. Quiet at first, then louder, stronger. People rose to their feet, some with wide eyes, some with tears brimming. The girl who had been laughed at was no longer invisible. She was standing, in a sense, on the shoulders of her own courage, bathed in the recognition she had earned through years of quiet dedication. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. Music had always been more than sound. It was resilience, courage, and honesty. It was the power to transform fear into beauty, doubt into confidence, and silence into a story that could be felt by anyone willing to listen. She had begun as a girl who was laughed at, and now, through the language of her hands, she had claimed her place. The moment her fingers left the final key, the hall was quiet. Not the polite silence that comes with waiting for applause, but a stunned, frozen kind of quiet, the kind that makes people stop breathing for a heartbeat or two. Everyone stared, some with their mouths slightly open, others with wide eyes. The girl, who had walked in timidly just minutes ago, who had been laughed at and mocked, was now the center of something unexpected, something powerful. The music she had created filled every corner of the hall, echoing off the walls, leaving no room for doubt or judgment. Some in the audience were leaning forward in their seats, as if trying to understand how someone so small and quiet could produce something so grand. Others sat back, hands clasped, breathing slowly, their expressions showing disbelief. People who had whispered jokes, who had smirked at her appearance, were now shifting uncomfortably. Their laughter had disappeared completely, replaced with something they weren't used to: awe. A few people exchanged glances, silently asking each other, "Did you hear that? Was that really just a girl playing?" She remained seated at the piano, hands still hovering above the keys, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was time to stop. But no one did. No one could. The power of what she had just played had transformed the space. The hall, once filled with casual chatter and laughter, was now suspended in a moment of shared surprise and emotion. It was a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. Her heart pounded in her chest. Not from fear this time, but from exhilaration. She had done it. She had taken all the years of practice, all the hidden hours of struggle, and brought them to life in front of strangers who had doubted her. She had been laughed at just minutes ago, and now they were seeing a version of her they had never imagined. The irony was not lost on her, and a small, quiet smile crossed her face. Some in the audience began to clap slowly, tentatively, as if unsure whether applause was appropriate after something so unexpected. But soon the clapping grew louder, stronger, more confident. One by one, people stood up, some with tears in their eyes, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The girl, who had seemed invisible, who had been dismissed and mocked, was now commanding the respect and admiration of everyone present. A few people in the crowd looked ashamed, their earlier laughter still fresh in their minds. One man, who had been the loudest in mocking her, now stared with wide eyes, clearly regretting his earlier behavior. Another woman, who had whispered a joke to her friend, now looked embarrassed, as if wishing she could take back her words. They realized that their judgments had been shallow, based solely on appearances, and that they had underestimated the depth and skill of someone they thought was unworthy of attention. The girl allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The music had done more than just silence the audience. It had changed the way they saw her. She was no longer just the timid girl who had nervously approached the piano. She was an artist, a storyteller, a person capable of evoking emotion through her hands alone. That recognition, even if unspoken, was more valuable than any applause. People began to move closer, some whispering softly to each other about how incredible it had been. A few asked quietly if she had performed professionally before, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The girl felt a strange mix of pride and humility. She had not played for fame or money or recognition. She had played because it was who she was. But now, standing silently in the room, she understood that her music had touched others in ways she had never imagined. One by one, people approached her, offering congratulations, praise, and genuine admiration. Their words were simple, but heartfelt. "That was beautiful. I didn't expect that. You're amazing." Each comment filled her with warmth, a feeling she had rarely experienced before. It was different from practicing alone in her room, different from even the quiet appreciation she had received from family or neighbors. This was public acknowledgement, the kind that made her feel seen, truly seen. For the first time, she looked up at the audience, meeting their eyes for the first time since she had started playing. She saw the surprise, the respect, the wonder. Some faces were bright with joy, others with disbelief, but all reflected a shared understanding. She had done something extraordinary. She realized that she had not only performed a piece of music. She had shattered the assumptions and judgments of everyone who had doubted her. The energy in the hall shifted again, this time in a way that was almost tangible. People who had been hesitant now spoke openly, asking questions, complimenting her technique, marveling at the emotion in her playing. Others were silent, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The girl felt a connection to each person, a sense that her music had reached across the distance between performer and audience, touching something universal in each of them. She also noticed that some people were quietly recording the moment, their phones capturing the unexpected magic of her performance. At first, she had been nervous about this, unsure whether they were mocking her. But now she understood that they wanted to share something beautiful, something rare. It was validation of her talent and proof that her courage to step forward had mattered. Her thoughts wandered back to all the times she had been laughed at, ignored or dismissed. She remembered the harsh words, the cruel jokes, the people who told her she would never amount to anything. And now, seeing the respect and admiration in the eyes of strangers, she felt a quiet triumph. Those moments of mockery, which had once seemed so powerful, now felt small and distant. She had proven to herself, first and foremost, that she was capable of something remarkable. Some of the audience members approached her more directly, asking how long she had been playing, where she had learned, and whether she had performed in other places. She answered modestly, explaining that she had practiced in secret for many years, often alone with no one to watch or listen. Her story fascinated them. They were amazed that someone who had appeared so shy and timid could possess such skill and emotion. The girl realized that the performance had become more than just a display of talent. It had become a lesson for the audience, a reminder not to judge others by appearances. The people who had laughed at her earlier had learned something valuable, that ability and courage often come from unexpected places. That day, they had witnessed the transformation of someone who had been overlooked into someone unforgettable. Her heart swelled with emotion, but she remained calm and composed. She knew that this moment, as powerful as it was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The applause, the admiration, the shock, it was all a sign that her talent could no longer be hidden. The world had caught a glimpse of what she could do, and she was ready to embrace the possibilities. Slowly, the room began to return to normal. Conversations resumed, though now with a tone of respect and wonder rather than casual chatter. People lingered longer, reluctant to leave, as if they wanted to savor the memory of what they had just experienced. The girl stood up from the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Feeling a sense of calm and satisfaction that she had never felt before, she looked around the hall one last time, taking in the faces of the people who had once doubted her. Some smiled warmly, others nodded in quiet respect. And in that moment she understood something profound. Her courage to play, to risk humiliation, had changed not only the way others saw her, but the way she saw herself. She had stepped into the light, and the world had responded with admiration and awe. The girl left the piano that day not just as a performer, but as someone who had reclaimed her voice. She had turned laughter and doubt into recognition and respect. And she knew that no matter what came next, she would never forget the feeling of that moment, when she had been laughed at, and the moment that had followed, when her music had spoken louder than any words, shocking everyone and proving that talent, courage, and heart cannot be ignored. The applause still echoed in her ears as she stepped away from the piano. It was a strange, almost dizzying feeling, one she had never experienced before. For years she had practiced in silence, hidden away in corners of her home, in small rooms, or in quiet moments when no one was watching. Music had been her private companion, her secret world. But now she realized something important. What had been private could also touch others. What she had feared would bring ridicule had instead brought admiration, respect, and even awe. People approached her in groups, some hesitantly, some with obvious excitement. Musicians, teachers, and even strangers who had simply been curious now spoke to her. They asked questions, complimented her technique, and marveled at the depth of emotion she had expressed. Some asked if she had studied professionally, others wondered how long she had been playing. She answered modestly, explaining that she had practiced alone for years, learning and growing without anyone noticing. Each question reminded her of the long road she had traveled, of the moments when she had doubted herself but kept going anyway. She noticed the expressions on their faces. There was surprise, certainly, but also something deeper: respect. They were not just impressed by her skill, but by the courage it had taken to play, to step forward despite being laughed at, to share a part of herself that had been hidden for so long. That realization filled her with a quiet pride. She had faced fear and judgment and had come through on the other side, stronger and more certain of her own worth. A few people in the crowd were still talking about what had just happened. They repeated the notes of the melody in their heads, trying to understand how someone so young and unassuming could produce such beauty. Some were moved to tears, others simply shook their heads, unable to find words. She watched silently, letting the reactions wash over her. It was overwhelming, yes, but in a comforting way. For the first time, she felt that her music had a real impact, that it could reach others and make them feel something deep and true. After a while, a man who seemed to be one of the event organizers approached her. He spoke quietly but earnestly, asking if she would consider performing at other events, sharing her music more widely. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready for that level of attention. But then she thought about all the years she had spent in silence, all the music she had kept to herself, and she realized she wanted to share it. Not for fame, not for recognition, but because music was meant to be heard. Because the beauty she had carried for so long deserved a chance to touch others. Opportunities began to unfold quickly after that day. Musicians she met offered to mentor her, giving advice and guidance to help her refine her skills. She was invited to perform in other halls, on small stages, and eventually on larger platforms. Each invitation was a reminder that the courage she had shown by simply playing that piano had opened doors she had never imagined. It was no longer just about proving herself. It was about embracing her gift and using it to connect with others. Despite the growing attention, she remained humble. She never forgot the quiet nights of practice, the hours spent learning in isolation, the moments when she had felt invisible and unworthy. Those experiences had shaped her, and they reminded her that talent was only part of the story. Determination, patience, and the willingness to take risks were just as important. She understood now that courage was not always loud or flashy. It could be quiet, persistent, and unassuming, just like her. As she traveled to new performances, she encountered people who had doubted her, people who had laughed at her earlier, and even strangers who had once overlooked her potential. Some apologized, some expressed regret, and some simply watched in awe. She did not let their past behavior affect her. Instead, she focused on the music and the impact it could have. She realized that her journey was not about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about embracing her own abilities and sharing them with the world. The experiences she gained also taught her about empathy. She remembered the girl she once was, timid and uncertain, laughed at and overlooked. That memory made her patient with others who were struggling, who felt unseen, or who doubted themselves. She began to encourage young musicians, sharing her story and helping them understand that talent and courage could exist even in the quietest, most unexpected people. She became a source of inspiration, not because of fame or accolades, but because of her authenticity and her willingness to face fear and vulnerability head-on. Her life gradually transformed. She no longer felt invisible. The shy, quiet girl who had walked nervously into that hall had become a young woman who understood her own power, her own value, and her ability to affect others. She had learned that moments of judgment and laughter could be stepping stones, not barriers, if met with resilience and courage. She carried herself with a newfound confidence, not arrogance, but a calm certainty that came from knowing her own worth. Even with success, she remained grounded. She continued to practice in quiet moments, remembering the early days when music was her secret escape. She never lost sight of why she played, not for praise, not for recognition, but because music was a part of her soul, a language she had always needed to speak. And now, that language could be heard by others, touching hearts and inspiring change in ways she had never imagined. One day, as she reflected on her journey, she realized how much had changed in just a short time. The laughter that once stung now seemed distant and unimportant. The doubt she had carried for so long had been replaced with determination and confidence. And the piano, once a symbol of private escape, had become a bridge connecting her to the world. She understood that her courage to step forward, to play despite fear, had created a ripple effect far beyond what she could see. She continued to perform in various venues, each time feeling a mix of nerves and excitement, just as she had on that first day. But the fear had shifted. It was no longer a paralyzing force, but a companion, reminding her that every performance was an opportunity to grow, to connect, and to share. She embraced it fully, allowing the music to flow naturally, letting her heart guide her fingers and trusting that the audience would feel what she felt. Over time, she noticed something remarkable. her story, once personal and hidden, began to inspire others. Young musicians who had faced ridicule, who had been doubted or overlooked, reached out to her. They shared their struggles and thanked her for showing that perseverance and courage could lead to recognition, respect, and opportunity. She realized that her experience was not just her own, it had become a lesson, a source of hope for anyone who had ever felt underestimated or invisible. Through it all, she remained humble and true to herself. She never sought fame or fortune. She valued the impact of her music, the connection she created with her audience, and the opportunity to encourage others. Each performance was not just a display of talent, but a sharing of her journey, a reminder that courage and persistence could overcome doubt and judgment. As she looked back on that first day, when she had walked into the hall unsure and nervous, she marveled at how far she had come. The girl who had been laughed at for simply touching the piano had grown into someone who inspired, touched, and moved people with her music. She had transformed fear into strength, doubt into determination, and silence into a voice that could be heard far beyond the walls of any hall. And in her heart, she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey had opened doors she had never imagined, and the lessons she had learned, the power of courage, the importance of perseverance, and the beauty of authenticity, would guide her for the rest of her life. She had faced ridicule, faced fear, and had emerged stronger, proving to herself and to the world that true talent, combined with bravery and heart, could never be ignored.